Well, as you know, South Africa assumed the rotating G20 presidency from Brazil around this time last year. And throughout 2025, the country has seen intense preparations across various sectors, with stakeholders developing key position papers that ultimately contributed to that leaders' declaration, a widely viewed, sign of success of the summit. Let's take stock, though, of what else we should think about. Bring in senior researcher with the Institute for Global Dialogue in Sanusha Naidu, who joins us now via our video link. And Sanusha, it was great seeing you in person at the weekend. Thanks for making time to be with us once again this Monday morning. As you've heard, I guess, from those different takes of the summit, there's certainly a golden thread with people really seeing the gathering as being a large success. And I wonder whether you're drinking that Kool-Aid this Monday morning.
Well, good morning to you, and good morning to the viewers. I'm not drinking the Kool-Aid. I need something much more for stamina, because I think you and I are both exhausted from what we saw, what we were feeling, and the adrenaline that was circulating in the media center at Nasrec. But I think, just to touch on a few things. I mean, now that the G20 has been, well, I don't know if it's still officially handed over, but South Africa's presidency has come to an end when President Ramaphosa closed it yesterday afternoon with the gavel. And I think this is really now the stock take time. We have to remember that the G20 moment was pivotal in terms of the adoption of the consensus declaration. But also we got to remember that this is not now the end of what South Africa and the African Union have to do in terms of front loading and making sure that the African development, growth, inequality questions are put back, are firmly secured onto the agenda of the G20 going forward. We also must recognize that next year's G20, or rather the G20 under the US presidency, would definitely be one that will ebb and flow. I mean, we recognize that in the last paragraph of the declaration, where it's paraphrased that we welcome the presidency of the US of the G20, and we'll meet again in 2027 in the UK. Very, very important statement if you unpack it, because there's almost an implicit recognition in that paragraph that it's going to be a difficult year under the US. But having said that, I think one of the key issues around this was how much the African context and the African development issues were front and center, from the debt question to issues around the Compact with Africa 2.0, to putting in more frameworks around development, the inequality report, and of course the questions around the African expert panel report around dealing with issues around the cost of capital and how that impacts on Africa. And so we're hoping that doesn't fall off the agenda, but I think now the actual sustainability of this agenda needs to go forward.
Yeah, as the cliche goes, the devil's really in the detail, and I see part of the criticisms of that declaration from one of the morning papers today is that, in many instances there are no really firm timelines or details on how to see through to those objectives that you talk about. So whilst the ideas, I think, are captured in a way that many people would have wanted, there's still a bit of murkiness about how you'd move from just having them on paper to, I suppose, shifting the dial on the ground, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think one of the things you've got to remember, Ayanda, is that the G20 is not a body that essentially has a formal secretariat. The decisions that they make are informing the global architecture. And so you need to look at this declaration, you need to look at the G20 as that architecture that's now in a state of evolution. And so these are the 20 countries, or 19 countries, plus the 2 regional bodies that 26 years ago were considered to be, if not longer, were considered to be key actors underpinning both the global financial architecture in terms of their size, their economy, and of course their leverage, but also in terms of global governance. So we have to be very careful in placing all our eggs in the G20 basket, because we don't know what the G20 will look like in the next 5 years. That is why the mention in the president's, both in his speech, in his opening address, but also in terms of the mandate given to South Africa to now go undertake the review of the G20 at 20, is so important because it gives you an indication of where we are and how we have to deal with this very, very dystopian global order. But of course, what happened over the weekend at Nasdaq now tells us that we're also entering a very important era of the global order where we're no longer going to be confined to a particular set of countries or a particular country determining that global order.
Yeah.
Having said that, I think the reason why we have to be careful in saying that the G20 now is going to be the panacea for us is that these are actors that have all kinds of interests in the global architecture. So for me, I think the opportunity is to how do you domesticate, regionalize this language, but also make sure you keep pushing it in terms of when you go from the broad language in the G20 to actual implementation, and not implementation, but actual decisions that are made based on how do you want to shift that trajectory around UN security reform, around questions around cost of capital, but also in terms of the biasness of credit rating agencies, and of course the whole thing around critical minerals. So I think the idea here is the G20 is not going to be the big group that's going to change, going to push the implementation. It has to come from the bottom up.
Sure. And I wonder if still, if it's clear enough about what that would look like. But I want to just piggyback off what you've just said, because Reuters is also quoting the German chancellor as saying that the world is undergoing a realignment with new connections being made. And that was in reference, I suppose, to the US's absence, that perhaps it wasn't the greatest idea, given, that fact that, things are shifting. The landscape is being remolded. But the question I want to pose to you is where you reckon that leaves South Africa, given the sentiment, generally speaking, about how this summit actually went?
Well, I think it leaves South Africa both having the affirmation and the credibility and legitimacy as an actor that was able to pull off this G20 and even get a consensus declaration without one of the major actors, if not what people have been defining and reflecting as an actor that underpins the global architecture. And I think that's important because if you saw the optics in the room, if you also saw the way in which the G20 family picture came out towards the photo op, you kind of got the sense that it was important to recognize that South Africa took on a G20 at the most difficult time. However, it also requires us now to work very strategically with our African partners, particularly under the AU, and for the African partners to work strategically with South Africa as well, because you now have this voice at the table, but you also have a seat at the table, and you need to use that in a much more nuanced way. So I think some of the sideline meetings that we saw after the declaration of the summit on Saturday was what happened with, for example, India, Australia, and Canada having a digital innovation trilateralism develop. We saw the IPSA summit, the India, Brazil, South Africa summit come into play. We saw countries coming in, for example, the UAE coming and providing funds. All of this is important, but we have to now start thinking about how do we make sure that this. And it's not South Africa alone that has to do this. It has to work in tandem, in partnership with its African partners, and it's a two-way street.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of being strategic, I've heard a few commentators saying President Cyril Ramaphosa should be very careful about how he goes about participating next year, given, I suppose, what we've learned about how the U.S. works, Washington more specifically, this idea that he should guard against being embarrassed, whatever that looks like. But I wonder what you reckon should be the approach. If the U.S. were to retaliate next year, for example, do you see a scenario where some of South Africa's friends elsewhere in the world would toe the line in the name of maintaining, the integrity and the sanctity of this G20 gathering?
It's fascinating how we recognize that the U.S. is still very much an integral part of the global order. But what we saw this weekend was the world continued to exist despite the U.S.'s seat at the G20 summit being empty. And I think we got to now start moving away from that narrative that if we don't do this and we don't placate the U.S., then we're going to be in trouble. I think what we saw at the weekend, particularly where President of France, Macron, coming in and kneeling down to President Ramaphosa at the summit and talking about how important this was and thanking him. I mean, leaders in Europe have also become quite, I think, disillusioned by the tactics of the US. And so I think this idea that we're going to be careful all the time, it's important that we have to be strategic and we have to understand what we want to engage in terms of the US, because they still hold relevance in the international order. But again, I think we are seeing that the US is also a country that needs to understand that it's not holding all of the relevance right now. And so that re-engineering of the global order is becoming quite an interesting dynamic. So for me, I think next year is going to be interesting. But again, you know, if commentators are not reading that last paragraph, which kind of says we'll kind of be there in 2026, but we're really going to meet strategically in 2027, tells you that there's a sense that we may have to just deal with what's coming in 2026 and then just kind of pivot to 2027. And that means that you got to be thinking about this in the manner in which what happened in how this construction of the international order is being realigned. The second point, and then very quickly, is this issue that we have to think about the trade. But one of the things that we haven't understood or we haven't talked about enough in South Africa's presidency of the G20, and this constant focus about the US. Which US are you talking about? Yes, the trade, the US trade representative. You're talking about the more bigger dynamic of the administration in the White House. But the other thing is that there are businesses outside of that space who are still at the B20 and other fora who have still kind of said, we want to do business with South Africa. And I think the opportunity of those sideline engagements that happen normally at big summits, the US kind of lost that out as well. So I would say, yes, we got to think about it. There's still a door that is open. But also the challenge is now, you know, it's not about how South Africa needs to placate the US. I think it's now how the US needs to think about the world in terms of what just happened in the context of its absence, but also opening up that door in terms of saying, well, countries in Europe are also perhaps not really now feeling comfortable with the US, and there's a trust deficit.
Yeah, and maybe that's why that declaration was adopted so quickly, right? We all, in some ways, feel like we're in the same boat. And to your point, the show really does go on because a major retailer based in the US opened its doors here in South Africa at the weekend in the US's absence at the G20 summit. So I suppose point taken. You know, you started off by mentioning how tired you are. Spare a thought for the president. I'm seeing a tweet from the presidency's office that he's hopped onto a plane to Angola for another summit over the next 2 days. So at least we're in a better position in some ways or the other. Sanusha Naidu, always a pleasure. Thanks very much indeed for speaking to us. Sanusha is a senior researcher with the Institute for Global Dialogue. So we'll certainly keep a very close eye, of course, on that story around the G20 summit and its rotating presidency headed next to Washington.